Every American is trapped inside a financial system they cannot escape. The United States government owes $38 trillion. Your state owes billions. Your city owes millions. You personally, even if you've never taken a loan, owe your share of the national debt. That's $115,000 per citizen, $308,000 per taxpayer. Money you'll spend your entire life paying interest on but never repaying. But here's the paradox that reveals everything. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? Follow that question. Track who holds the debt. Trace where the interest payments flow. And you'll discover something that should terrify you. The debt isn't owed to foreign nations or random investors. It's owed to a small network of American institutions, banks, asset managers, and financial elites who engineered the system deliberately across 5 generations. They built a machine where debt can never be repaid, where borrowing must expand forever, where interest flows perpetually upward, and where you cannot opt out because the dollar in your pocket is part of the machinery. This isn't conspiracy, this is documented history. The meetings happened, the documents exist, the legislation passed, the mechanisms are public record. And once you see how they built it, you'll understand why $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. Let me show you the 5 architects, the 5 moments when the trap was engineered, and why every American is now caught inside it with no escape. Before 1790, the newly independent United States had no unified debt structure. States owed money from the Revolutionary War. The Continental Congress had issued worthless paper. Soldiers hadn't been paid. And most Americans believed all war debt should simply be forgiven. Start fresh. It was the populist position. Alexander Hamilton destroyed that possibility forever. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury, but before that he was a Wall Street lawyer representing New York's merchant class, the men who'd bought up Revolutionary War bonds at pennies on the dollar from desperate soldiers and farmers. These merchants needed the federal government to honor those bonds at full value. If the debt was forgiven, they'd lose everything. Hamilton's plan was brilliant political engineering. In January 1790, he submitted his report on public credit to Congress. The proposal had 3 components. First, the federal government would assume all state debts from the war, consolidating $75 million in obligations at the federal level. Second, the government would issue new bonds to replace old debt, making it permanent and tradable. Third, and most critically, the debt would never be paid off. Instead, the government would make perpetual interest payments funded by new federal taxes, specifically tariffs and excise taxes on whiskey. This was revolutionary. Hamilton explicitly modeled it on the British system: permanent debt, interest paid forever, bonds traded as financial instruments. But he disguised it as nation building. He told Congress that establishing good credit required honoring obligations. He said a national debt would bind creditors to the government's success. He called it a national blessing. What he didn't say was who would profit. The merchant class who'd bought bonds cheap would be paid full value plus interest. Northern financiers would dominate the new bond market. And the federal government would become structurally dependent on borrowing because the debt could never be eliminated, only refinanced. Congress was split. Southern states had mostly paid their war debts. They didn't want to assume Northern obligations. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed Hamilton's plan as a giveaway to speculators. But Hamilton made a deal. He'd support moving the capital to the south, to what would become Washington, D.C., if Jefferson supported the debt assumption. The deal passed in July 1790. The Funding Act made federal debt permanent. And the structure Hamilton created persists 235 years later. The United States has never been debt-free since. Not once. Not for a single year. Here's why this matters. Before Hamilton, debt was temporary. You borrowed, you repaid, or you defaulted. The ledger cleared, but Hamilton made debt structural. The government would always owe money. It would always pay interest. And the bond market would always exist as a mechanism to extract wealth from taxpayers and transfer it to bondholders. Within 20 years, the merchant class Hamilton served became America's first financial aristocracy. They didn't build factories or invent products. They held bonds. And every tariff collected, every tax paid, sent a portion to them as interest. Forever. Hamilton died in 1804, shot by Aaron Burr, but his system lived. Federal debt grew from 75 million in 1790 to 2.7 billion by 1865 after the Civil War, then 16 billion after World War I, then 260 billion after World War II. Each expansion required more bonds, more interest, more wealth flowing upward. The trap Hamilton set in 1790 had been sprung, and there was no way to reverse it without collapsing the government's ability to function. By 1900, America's financial system was chaotic. Thousands of state banks issued their own currencies. Interest rates fluctuated wildly, and there was no mechanism to manage government borrowing at scale. Wall Street wanted control, and one man engineered it: John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan wasn't just a banker, he was the most powerful private citizen in America. His bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial trusts. By 1900, Morgan controlled assets worth more than the U.S. Treasury, and he used that power to reshape government finance. The first major test came in 1895. The U.S. Treasury was running out of gold. The government was legally required to back dollars with gold reserves, but those reserves were depleting. If they ran out, the dollar would collapse. President Grover Cleveland needed $65 million in gold immediately. Morgan offered a solution. He would personally arrange a private loan, not from the government borrowing publicly, but from a syndicate of banks Morgan would organize. The terms were staggering. Morgan's syndicate would buy government bonds at a discount and resell them to investors at full price. Morgan would pocket the spread, about $7 million, roughly $250 million in today's money. And the government would owe the syndicate, not the American people. Cleveland had no choice. He accepted. Morgan delivered the gold, and Wall Street learned a critical lesson. The government could be captured. When crisis hit, when the Treasury was desperate, private bankers could dictate terms. They could extract wealth directly from federal borrowing, and they could do it legally, wrapped in the language of saving the nation. Morgan used this leverage repeatedly. In 1901, he organized U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, by consolidating dozens of companies. In 1902, he personally resolved a national coal strike by forcing mine owners and unions to accept arbitration. He wasn't elected. He wasn't appointed. He simply had more power than the government. But the real transformation came in 1907. That year, a financial panic erupted. Stock prices collapsed. Banks failed. Credit froze. The economy seized, and there was no central authority to stop it. The Treasury tried to help but didn't have enough resources. State banks couldn't coordinate. The system was collapsing. Morgan acted. He was 70 years old, but he took command. He gathered the most powerful bankers in New York, locked them in his library, and refused to let them leave until they pledged their own money to stabilize failing institutions. For 3 weeks, Morgan orchestrated a private bailout. He decided which banks survived and which failed. He directed capital flows. He essentially functioned as America's central bank. It worked. The panic subsided. But Morgan understood something critical. He couldn't do it again. He was too old. And next time, the panic might be too large for private intervention. Wall Street needed a permanent mechanism to control government finance and manage crises. They needed a central bank, but Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been destroyed by populist opposition. President Andrew Jackson had campaigned on killing the bank, and he won. So Morgan's circle designed a trap: make it look public, but ensure private control. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Morgan's key political ally, organized a secret meeting. The location was Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private club owned by Morgan and other elite families. For 9 days, Aldrich met with representatives from the nation's largest banks: J.P. Morgan and Company, National City Bank, First National Bank, and Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Also present was Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who understood European central banking. The meeting was secret because if the public discovered that Wall Street was designing America's monetary system, there would be riots. So the attendees traveled separately, used only first names, and told no one where they were going. What they designed became the Federal Reserve, The structure was brilliant political camouflage. It wouldn't be called a central bank. It would be called the Federal Reserve System. It wouldn't be one institution in New York. It would be 12 regional banks spread across the country. It wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It looked decentralized, democratic, and public. But the actual power structure ensured Wall Street dominance. The 12 regional Federal Reserve banks would be privately owned by member banks. Those member banks would elect the directors of the regional feds. And the most important power, the authority to conduct open market operations, to create money and buy government bonds, would rest with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The New York Fed would be controlled by the largest banks. Morgan's banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913. Most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. President Woodrow Wilson signed it. And immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now the government didn't just borrow from private investors. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's the mechanism. The Treasury issues a bond. The Federal Reserve buys it with newly created dollars. The government spends the money. The debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, and taxpayers service the interest forever. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to government borrowing. Banks only had so much capital to lend. But now the Fed could create money specifically to buy government bonds. The government could borrow infinitely, and the interest payments would flow to the banks that owned the Federal Reserve System. Morgan died in March 1913, 9 months before the Federal Reserve was created, but his legacy is the structure that enables $38 trillion in debt. Without the Federal Reserve, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. The market wouldn't absorb it. But with the Fed guaranteeing demand, there's no limit. The trap became infinite. By 1971, the Federal Reserve had been creating dollars to buy government bonds for 58 years. But there was still a constraint, the Bretton Woods system. Under Bretton Woods, established in 1944, the dollar was backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Foreign governments could redeem dollars for gold. This limited how much the Federal Reserve could print. If they created too many dollars, foreign governments would drain U.S. gold reserves. By 1971, the U.S. was running out of gold. The Vietnam War was expensive. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were expensive. The government was spending far more than it collected in taxes. The Federal Reserve was creating dollars to cover the deficits. And foreign governments, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, were redeeming those dollars for gold. President Richard Nixon faced a choice: stop spending, raise taxes, and endure a recession, or break the gold link and allow unlimited money creation. On the 15th of August, 1971, Nixon announced the decision on national television. The United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. It was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. This was the most consequential financial decision in American history. Overnight, the dollar became pure fiat currency. It wasn't backed by anything except the government's promise, and the Federal Reserve could now create unlimited dollars with no constraint. The debt trap, which had been contained by gold, became infinite. But Nixon's team understood the problem. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold, why would anyone accept it? Why would foreign governments hold dollars as reserves? The system would collapse unless they created a new anchor. Enter Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor and later Secretary of State. Kissinger engineered the solution: make oil the anchor. In 1973, Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia. He met with King Faisal and made an offer. The United States would provide military protection, weapons, and political support to the Saudi regime. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would agree to two things. First, sell oil only in dollars. Second, invest Saudi oil revenues in U.S. Treasury bonds. The deal was formalized. By 1974, the arrangement extended to the entire organization of petroleum exporting countries. Every major oil producer agreed to price oil in dollars. This created artificial global demand for dollars. Every country needed dollars to buy energy. They had to hold dollar reserves. They had to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This is the petrodollar system, and it's the mechanism that makes infinite U.S. debt possible. Here's how it works. The U.S. government spends more than it collects. The Federal Reserve creates dollars to cover the deficit by buying treasury bonds. Those dollars flow into the global economy. Foreign governments accumulate those dollars because they need them to buy oil. Then they invest those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds because treasuries are the safest, most liquid dollar-denominated asset. The circle is complete. The U.S. borrows. The Fed prints. The world buys oil. The dollars return as loans to the U.S. government, and the debt expands perpetually with no foreign constraint. But the brilliance is darker than that. The system forces foreign nations to finance U.S. deficits. Saudi Arabia, China, Japan, they hold trillions in treasury bonds, not because they want to lend to America, but because they have no choice. If they dump treasuries, they crash the dollar, destroy the value of their own reserves, and destabilize the entire global economy. They're trapped. We're trapped. Everyone is locked into a system where U.S. debt must expand forever, and foreign governments must keep financing it. Kissinger understood this perfectly. In 1974, he said in a private meeting, later documented in declassified files, "Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people. Control money and you control the world." The petrodollar gave America control of global money, and it made U.S. government debt the foundation of the entire international financial system. The debt isn't a burden. It's the product America exports, treasury bonds, and the world has to buy them. Nixon resigned in 1974. Kissinger left office in 1977. But the system they built persists. 53 years later, the dollar remains the global reserve currency, not because it's backed by gold or productivity, but because it's backed by oil. And oil is backed by U.S. military dominance. The trap Nixon and Kissinger set in 1971 made American debt infinite and inescapable. Not just for Americans, for the entire world. By 1979, the petrodollar system was functioning, but inflation was out of control. The Federal Reserve had been creating dollars for a decade. Prices were rising 13% annually. The dollar was weakening, and foreign governments were losing confidence. Paul Volcker became Federal Reserve Chairman in August 1979. His mandate was to crush inflation, even if it required destroying the economy. Volcker raised interest rates to 20%, the highest in American history. Mortgage rates hit 18%. Businesses couldn't borrow. Unemployment surged to 10%. The U.S. entered the worst recession since the Great Depression. But Volcker had a second target: developing nations. During the 1,970 seconds, American banks had lent hundreds of billions to developing countries: Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, the Philippines. These nations borrowed in dollars at low interest rates to build infrastructure and develop industries. The loans seemed manageable when rates were 6%, but when Volcker raised rates to 20%, the interest payments tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $87 billion. Argentina owed $43 billion, and the interest alone exceeded their entire export revenues. They couldn't pay. In August 1982, Mexico's finance minister informed the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve that Mexico would default. It couldn't make the next payment. Default. This should have triggered collapse. U.S. banks had lent most of that money. Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, all had massive exposure. If Mexico defaulted, the banks would take catastrophic losses. Some would fail. The entire American banking system was at risk. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks absorb the losses. Let the market clear. But he didn't, because the banks were too powerful, and their failure would threaten the Federal Reserve's control. Instead, Volcker orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of other nations enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. But the loans came with conditions. The conditions were called structural adjustment programs. and they were designed to transfer wealth and sovereignty. Governments had to cut public spending, privatize state assets, eliminate subsidies, open markets to foreign corporations, deregulate industries, and devalue currencies. Essentially, dismantle economic sovereignty in exchange for the money to keep paying interest to American banks. And here's the critical detail. The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They restructured it, made it perpetual. Countries that couldn't pay were given new loans to service old loans. The debt never shrank, it just became permanent. This is the mechanism that turned sovereign default into impossible. When a nation couldn't pay, the IMF stepped in not to forgive debt, but to refinance it, extract concessions, and ensure interest payments continued flowing to American financial institutions. The pattern has repeated for 42 years. Mexico in 1982, Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2010, Pakistan in 2019, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time the same structure: IMF loans to prevent default, austerity imposed, sovereignty surrendered, and the debt made permanent. This is Volcker's innovation. The debt trap became a tool of imperial control. Nations that couldn't pay were forced to open their economies, sell their resources, and submit to American financial institutions in exchange for staying in the system. Volcker left the Federal Reserve in 1987, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures no nation can escape. Default isn't allowed. Debt is restructured, made perpetual, and used as leverage to extract wealth and political compliance. The trap is no longer just American, it's global, and every nation on Earth is caught inside it. By 2008, the debt trap Hamilton built, Morgan industrialized, Nixon globalized, and Volcker weaponized had reached a breaking point. The financial system nearly collapsed. Lehman Brothers failed, AIG failed, the global economy seized. The Federal Reserve responded with the largest money creation in history, quantitative easing. Between 2008 and 2022, the Fed's balance sheet expanded from $800 billion to $9 trillion. The Treasury issued bonds. The Fed bought them with newly created dollars. The government borrowed trillions. But here's what changed. Who ended up holding the debt? Before 2008, Treasury bonds were held by a wide range of investors: foreign governments, pension funds, insurance companies, individuals. But after 2008, ownership concentrated into three massive asset managers: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These firms manage over $20 trillion in assets. They don't own the money, they manage it. Pension funds, retirement accounts, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, all of that capital flows through BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And these firms decide where to invest it. Increasingly, they invest in U.S. Treasury bonds. Because treasuries are safe, they're liquid, they're backed by the government's taxing power, and they pay interest. Here's the mechanism. You contribute to your 401k. That money goes to a mutual fund managed by BlackRock. BlackRock uses it to buy treasury bonds. The government pays interest on those bonds. BlackRock collects the interest, takes a management fee, and credits the rest to your account. But here's what you don't see. The interest comes from your taxes. You pay taxes to the federal government. The government uses that tax revenue to pay interest on the debt. That interest flows to BlackRock. BlackRock credits your retirement account. You just paid yourself, minus the government's operating costs and BlackRock's fees. It's a closed loop. Taxpayers fund the interest payments, asset managers collect them, and the debt expands perpetually. But it's worse than that, because BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street also own each other, and they own the banks, and they own the corporations. Vanguard is the largest shareholder in BlackRock. BlackRock and Vanguard are the largest shareholders in JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. They're the largest shareholders in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google. This is unprecedented concentration. Three firms managing money for millions of people, controlling ownership stakes in virtually every major corporation, and holding trillions in government bonds. They don't just profit from the debt, they control the entire structure. And here's the final piece. These firms have direct access to the Federal Reserve. In 2020, during the COVID crisis, the Federal Reserve hired BlackRock to manage its bond buying programs. BlackRock decided which corporate bonds the Fed would purchase. They essentially controlled the Fed's intervention in credit markets. This isn't conspiracy. It's public record. The Federal Reserve announced the arrangement. BlackRock disclosed the contract. It's legal, but it reveals the final form of the trap. The debt system Hamilton created in 1790 has evolved into a machine where a tiny number of financial institutions control government borrowing, manage the debt, collect the interest, and influence monetary policy. The government, the Fed, and the asset managers are fused. They're not separate. They're components of the same system, and every American is locked inside it. Your taxes service the debt. Your retirement account holds the bonds. The dollars you earn are created through government borrowing. You can't opt out. The system is totalizing. Now let me show you how this trap has been tested and reinforced through 5 major financial crises over the last century. Each time the system didn't collapse. It concentrated more power upward. 1929, the Great Depression. Stock market crashed, banks failed, credit froze. The government response was to expand federal borrowing and create new institutions to manage debt. The result was Social Security, federal deposit insurance, and massive public works programs, all funded by bonds. Federal debt went from $16 billion in 1929 to $260 billion by 1945. The debt trap expanded. 1,970 seconds. Stagflation. Inflation and unemployment surged simultaneously. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. The response was Nixon's petrodollar system and Volcker's interest rate shock. The result was dollar dominance secured through oil and developing nations trapped in permanent IMF debt. The trap became global. 1987. Black Monday. Stock market crashed 22% in a single day. The Federal Reserve intervened by flooding markets with liquidity. The response was the Greenspan put. The implicit Fed promise to prevent market collapses by creating money. The result was moral hazard. Investors learned the Fed would always bail out markets. Risk-taking exploded. The debt trap was guaranteed by central bank intervention. 2008. Global financial crisis. Housing bubble burst. Lehman failed. Credit markets seized. The response was quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve created trillions to buy bonds and stabilize banks. The result was asset price inflation. Stocks, real estate, and bonds surged. Wealth concentrated in asset holders. And federal debt doubled from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. The trap became financialized. 2020, 2025. The debt supercycle. COVID lockdowns crashed the economy. The response was $5 trillion in federal spending, funded entirely by Federal Reserve money creation. Federal debt hit $38 trillion. Interest payments hit $1 trillion annually. The result is the current system. Debt is infinite, the Fed is the primary buyer, and wealth extraction through interest payments is permanent. 5 crises, same pattern. Each time the government borrows more, the Fed creates more money, asset prices rise, wealth concentrates, and the debt trap tightens. This isn't failure. This is the system functioning exactly as designed. Each crisis is an opportunity to expand the debt, justify more Fed intervention, and concentrate more wealth in the hands of institutions that hold the bonds. Here's what you need to understand. The $38 trillion in U.S. debt will never be repaid. It can't be, because the dollars you use to pay taxes are created when the government borrows. If the government paid off the debt, the money supply would collapse. Deflation, depression, economic collapse. So the debt must expand forever. The government must borrow perpetually. The Federal Reserve must create money continuously, and interest must flow from taxpayers to bondholders in perpetuity. This is structural. It's not a policy choice. It's the foundation of the monetary system. And here's who profits: the institutions that hold the debt. BlackRock manages $10 trillion. Vanguard manages $7 trillion. State Street manages $4 trillion. Together, they control ownership stakes in virtually every major corporation and hold enormous positions in treasury bonds. Every year, the U.S. government pays roughly $1 trillion in interest on the debt. That money flows from taxpayers to bondholders. It's the largest wealth transfer in human history. Continuous, structural, and invisible to most people because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. But it's the same mechanism. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never shrinks. You cannot opt out, you cannot refuse to participate. Even if you hold no personal debt, you owe your share of the national debt. You pay through taxes, you pay through inflation, you pay through the declining purchasing power of every dollar you earn. The system is totalizing. The dollar is the trap. And every transaction you make, every dollar you earn, every tax you pay, feeds the machine that Hamilton designed, Morgan industrialized, Nixon globalized, Volcker weaponized, and BlackRock now manages 5 architects across 235 years. Alexander Hamilton made debt permanent in 1790. J. P. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Richard Nixon made it global in 1971. Paul Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. And the modern asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, turned it into the largest extraction machine in history. They didn't conspire together. They lived in different eras. But each solved a problem in a way that benefited financial elites. And each solution built on the previous one. The result is what we have today. A system where government debt can never be repaid, where borrowing must expand forever, where interest payments transfer wealth continuously from workers to capital, and where the average person is locked inside by design. The 38 trillion isn't a crisis. It's the business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It's collateral for more borrowing. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will service the debt, the system functions. But understand this. The trap is complete. Escape isn't possible. Not without collapsing the dollar, the bond market, the banking system, and the global financial order. You're inside the machine. And the people operating it are the ones who built it. If this changed how you see the financial system, if you finally understand that 38 trillion isn't a mistake, but a structure refined over 2 centuries, then you're starting to see how power actually works. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who's operating it. Because they're not going to teach you this in schools. They're going to teach you that debt is a problem to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't a problem. It's the foundation. And interest is the rent you pay to exist in their system. The trap is set, and every American is inside it.